pleased to introduce Adam Blum, who's going to talk about building mobile apps on various phones that all use a MVC framework with Ruby, which is a very exciting idea for me. And take it away, Adam.
Thanks, John. So today I'm going to talk to you about how you can build mobile apps for pretty much all smartphones, iPhone, Android, Windows Mobile, BlackBerry, all writing them one time using this framework that we have called Rhodes. So real briefly, the company that we've released Rhodes is called Roamable, and our mission is to mobilize applications very quickly with a great user experience. And the basic idea is to provide the high-level productivity and portability of web programming that I'm sure most of you are used to using, but still provide the device optimization and offline capability of native mobile apps that you might write in the native SDKs, whether it be Objective-C for the iPhone or Java for Android, and make all this available open source for rapid adoption by developers. So quick background on this, as you know, the smartphone sales are exploding. There are 5 major smartphone operating systems, but one of the problems is that the growth leaders are the installed base laggards. So what would you target? You'd have a hard time sort of building just for either iPhone or Android. And the other thing that's happened is that native apps have sort of won the day, right? Users sort of want stuff that runs on their phones, and doing sort of interactive, apps where people are creating information and doing that from mobile web browsers is just something that users are just not interested in doing today. Probably if I gave this presentation a year ago, people would say, well, I'll just build my mobile web app, and I think now when I talk to developers about this, I say, well, this is not the right session. Even though we're all about HTML for productivity, it's HTML to build apps that run natively on the phone, whether you're connected or disconnected. So that's what we let you do with Rhodes. We let you build the app quickly in HTML and Ruby. You write it once, and it runs on all smartphones. We actually think that you'll generally write, just like with a good Rails app, you'll write most of your UI or do most of your UI customization in HTML, because we have an app generator that generates basic scaffolding of an app, and most of our developers tell us they spend most of their time just playing with the Ruby templates, the ERB HTML templates. Rhodes is also focused on synced local data. So does that mean that you can't write stuff in Rhodes on the phone that reaches out and grabs from XML feeds and using the net HTTP libraries? And you can do all that, but we provide this infrastructure, this server called RhoSync and a sync client that lets you write your apps so that your development experience is that you're writing to data that's local on the device. You have an ORM, and it just looks like the data is local. And that whole problem of how do you get data from the back end to the device is something that, if you'd like, Rhodes can solve for you. We also want to exploit device capabilities. So it's all about writing rich apps, right? That's another reason why the mobile web approach is not as good, because you want to be able to use the GPS that's on your device. You want to be able to use the camera and the video and the local contacts. These devices are very powerful, and you want to use them. So we allow you to do that as well. It's with a combination of an extended set of tags, but also Ruby libraries. So sort of whichever you need for your app. If you want to just have the location, the GPS location, you can just put a geolocation tag in your HTML templates. If you need to do something more sophisticated, like look at the latitude or longitude and do some kind of computation on it, and then conditionally do things, then we have Ruby libraries that give you access to that as well. And this is all available open source. It's up on github.com/roamable, and that's real time. So it's always current with whatever our check-ins are. It's not like snapshots. If you don't see a check-in, multiple check-ins every day, then ping us and say, get back to work. So the 2 components that you'll generally use in your apps are Rhodes, which is a micro framework for building locally executing, natively optimized mobile apps. You'll basically run an app generator for the objects that you care about, and then you'll edit HTML templates. Then you'll just do a build, and then you'll have a functioning, we have rake scripts that do builds for all of the major smartphone OSs. Along the way, we had to build the first mobile Ruby implementations for all of these different platforms. The one exception is Symbian. There is a Symbian Ruby that was funded by the Symbian Foundation and a company called Pragmaticom that we worked with. Built that for the Symbian Foundation. That is actually out there. It's available open source, but they don't, unlike us, they don't keep every check-in live. So like the current version is not actually available, but we started with theirs, and then we've made a bunch of optimizations to make it work better on smaller devices. Just on the issue of the Ruby implementations, John was sort of asking me the question like, well, you know, how can you possibly, Ruby's pretty big. How do you fit it on all these devices? And this is where the framework gives us an advantage. The important thing is that the code that you would write in the framework, right, and you're sort of working within our MVC framework, the code that you would write within that has to work. It's not that any Ruby code that you could ever think up has to work. So we don't have every Ruby gem in there. Like we don't have the XML support in there. Could you add that? It's all open source, right? And the framework just gets compiled into your application. So you can absolutely pull all the gems you want into your project. We don't stop you from doing that. But because we have a framework, we can start with a very stripped down Ruby implementation. And that handles 98% of what programmers need to do. But if anybody wants to take it and says, well, we have, so I'm an adjunct at Carnegie Mellon, and some of the students there want to use Rhodes and implement XMPP to do real-time communication, and they want to add those libraries. There are some Ruby libraries for this. And we said, great, just do it. You know, would we take that back and put it into the framework? Probably not, unless there's a real compelling case to do that. And then the other piece we have is RhoSync, which is it's a sync server that's focused on web service data. It's focused on apps that expose some kind of REST or SOAP web service that you would connect to. So, and that could be, nowadays, that's basically any app. But it's unlike a lot of other previous sync servers like IntelliSync, et cetera. They're all about syncing databases, which ironically enough is sort of a harder problem in general. So it's a little simpler now with all these web services that are exposed, but there are also some things that make it harder. And IntelliSync was actually discontinued because they never made the shift, you know, to being optimized for web services. So that's what RhoSync does. All you really need to know as a developer is if you want to have something that will sync to a back end, you need to implement one Ruby class. It has 6 methods: login, query, create, update, delete, and log off. And whatever your back end exposes that you want to get to, as long as you can write Ruby code that within those 6 functions, it'll just work. So this is the architecture of what we've been talking about here. So your app is all these gold things. So you have a controller, which you would expect, right, in an MVC framework. And you have a bunch of HTML templates. They happen to be ERB files. And then on the back end, and nobody's forcing you to use RhoSync. If you want to do all your own real-time data capturing and retrieving, you can do that. But if you want to use RhoSync to sync up, you write this, what we call a source adapter, and that's this class that has the 6 methods. And so in this example, I had, you know, an app that has like 2 objects in it. That's another thing that Rhodes apps are sort of good for if you want to sort of do like a mobile mashup where you're maybe getting data from different sources. The best apps I've seen do quite a bit of that. You know, they'll get interesting data from various places. So in this example, there's, you know, a couple objects, and so there's more than one controller for each of these objects, some templates for them, and then source adapters. So, and then we provide all the things in red. So we have these Ruby interpreters. We have a simple ORM. It's called ROM. And so what it is, it's just a very stripped down object relational manager. If you looked at things like Hibernate or even Active Record, there's no way. If Active Record could have fit on the device, we would have used Active Record. But not only is Active Record too big, but so is Data Mapper and so is OGG, and they're just all like at least an order of magnitude too big. So ROM is just this very stripped down ORM. And then, of course, we have this RhoSync client that knows to talk to the RhoSync server and sends its data back and forth to the server very efficiently. We use JSON to do that. And sort of tries to optimize, just getting the data it needs from the server. The server sort of keeping a cache of what that device should have, and then trickle syncing it as appropriate down to the device. Now, there's another intriguing box here. People usually ask about, like, wait, you have a web server there? Why do you have a web server there? Why is that red box there? So, anybody have any guesses why a web server is there? It's all about local data. Why would we have a web server in the framework? So the reason why is we don't want to have to handle we want people to write in HTML because it's familiar, but we don't want to write an HTML renderer for every device. So what we do is we use the browser component that ships with whatever smartphone OS is there. And the good news is that in 2009, you've got really good embeddable browser components for all of these platforms. And nobody can tell once you build your app, by the way, that it's written with that browser component. We'll talk about later. We do some styling with, if anybody's ever seen IUI, which is Joe Hewitt, who's now at Facebook, wrote this library so that you can write HTML, but it looks like a native iPhone app. And so we've taken that sort of basic approach, extended it, made it even more optimal, but then did it for all the other OSs. So the net result is, even though there's a browser there, you can't really tell. It looks very close to a native app. But all of those browser controls expect to be talking to a web server. So that's why we have a very, very lightweight stripped down web server within there. And then we have another piece we ship with SQLite, and we have a bunch of synced local data sitting on top of SQLite. So those are the third-party components. So we ship with a couple sample apps, one for Sugar CRM, their open source CRM, sort of sales management package. So we ship with that sample. We ship with one for Siebel Field Service. And there's a number of third-party apps that are coming out now. There's a company called Carry the Day that has a product called Trail Guide, which is a mobile interface to Basecamp. It's a very nice app. It's out now. VDG Group is about to release a product called Mobile Lighthouse. Lighthouse is a hosted bug tracking system, and so this is a mobile interface to that. Also written with Rhodes. And Hampton Catlin, who is a pretty prominent Ruby developer, he wrote Haml, which is a really nice templating system that we don't support. He's actually not suggested that we do. It would be heavier weight. We use generic ERB templates, which is a simpler templating mechanism. But Hampton Catlin had written an entire iPhone app for the Wikipedia. It was one of the top-selling phones in the App Store, and then Wikipedia basically bought him and his app and said, but we want it to be free. So then he rewrote the whole thing for the iPhone, and then he read about our stuff in Ruby inside and said, oh, I'm going to throw that away, which he did. He actually pulled it off of GitHub, and he rewrote it in Rhodes, and now it runs on all devices. So let's talk about the overview of what it means to build a Rhodes app, and then we'll go and actually write one. So the first step is, with most Rails apps, you sort of want to start with your data, right? What's the data that you're working with? You don't have to. You can build your Rhodes app first, make it run locally, and then decide what data you're syncing with. In general, we think it doesn't work quite as well that way. It's better to start with what the data is. So we recommend that you create what we call a sync source. So you write your source adapter code. We give you a test interface to do that. So you can just test it from the web interface and make sure that you're bringing back all the data. So anybody that's sort of interested in sync, I've actually written most of the code for RhoSync, and we do a number of things in RhoSync that are sort of, I think, better ways of doing sync, but I'm not going to drill into those now. We can talk about it later if you want. The code's all up there. You can take a look at it on GitHub. Then you want to generate your app, your actual Rhodes app that runs on the client. So you'll run Rhodes Gen, and it generates your ERB templates and your controller, and then you'll just edit the code, edit the HTML, and then you do a build, and you have a functioning app. So let's try it, shall we? So, okay, so what I'm going to do is say Rhodes Gen App, and I'm going to call it my new app. By the way, if you're not sure of the usage, just say Rhodes Gen App. Now, by the way, Rhodes Gen is a gem like any other gem. John and I were talking earlier about how gems are just such a great way of getting functionality, far better than things like CPAN and apt-get, et cetera. It's just a great way of getting developer tools. So you just say gem install Rhodes, and you'll get Rhodes installed on your device. So that's where we got Rhodes Gen from. As long as you've done gem install Rhodes, you'll have Rhodes Gen. And it says, okay, app options. It basically just wants a name. So, and there's a variety of other options, but I'm just going to say Rhodes Gen App, my new app. Okay, and you can see we've got a bunch of files. This is hard discipline, standing still. So we have this app directory, and we've got a bunch of ERB templates in there. We've got a config RB file that lets us configure the app. And we've got this public directory. Should seem very familiar, those of you that are our Rails developers. I understand that's perhaps few and far between here, but so what we'll do is, now what we want to do is we want to generate a model. We probably will want to create multiple models, right? But let's start with one. So I'm going to write this little contact manager app, and I'm going to call my model contact. Well, let's first look at Rhodes Gen model, just to look at the usage. So it says, okay, what you want to do is give us a name, a source URL, and a source ID. Now, if I had done what I'd recommended to you guys, which is, define your sync source adapter, what I would do is I would just take the source URL, the URL where that sync source adapter is exposed, which would be like, on my test machine, would be like localhost, apps, localhost my app, source. And I would take that and supply it. What I want to do is show how easy it is to create a simple, offline app, which I don't think you've seen yet. I had built something from scratch that did the whole sync. But you can also create something that isn't necessarily about sync at all. So I'm going to say Rhodes Gen model, actually, let me go into the my new app directory. Okay, now I'm going to say Rhodes Gen model contact, and then I'm going to say no source URL, but I'll give it a source ID, and I'll say name, phone. Okay? And now I've got the model. Again, as a Rails developer, you're used to have a model, and then you get your scaffolding code, and that's what we have. So now I'll just fire up my trusty TextMate, and we'll look at our new app. So this is our app. You can see that we've got a top-level thing here, and then we have all the scaffolding to go and deal with editing, creating new contact records, and then we have this controller here. It's just a Ruby file. Looks very similar to the typical Rails scaffolding for doing basic CRUD on objects. But there are some differences. Some of the URL differences are the URL convention, for gets and what do you do for delete, is a bit different than you get with Rails. Now, those of you that are mobile developers, any guesses why? Because it would be great, obviously, if we could, we would just follow all the Rails conventions for URLs. So the reason why is these mobile browsers are all over the map in terms of the actual REST verbs that they support. Some of them don't support delete, some of them, do put in an unusual way. So we hewed as closely as we could to the Rails sort of REST conventions, but they're not quite exactly the same for that reason. But it's also part of the value of a mobile a mobile-oriented framework. So I don't really have to do much here to get something useful. The first thing I want to do, though, is just provide a link to this this object, the contact object. By the way, our 1.0 is about to release, and you won't actually have to. The idea is that we built our app first, and then we built the model. So now we have to go like tell our app about our model. There's actually a Lighthouse issue for 1.0 where it will actually, the model generator will modify the app homepage. But generally, you're going to want to edit this homepage and do cool branding stuff with it. And you can use, your familiar HTML, JavaScript, CSS toolkit to do that. So I'll say something like contacts here. And that's it. This is just HTML. So you can sort of go as far as you want with that. And notice that the HTML is very generic here. It's just div tags, right? And there's a reason for that. Any reason why? Notice that there's no sort of like styling like right in here. The reason why is we generally want to create very generic HTML here, and then we ship with the framework all of this styling in libraries. So we use IUI. It's 90% IUI to sort of style all of these div tags so that it looks like, a native iPhone app. Same thing for Windows Mobile and BlackBerry. And we've done our sort of best attempt at, making something that's native. And this is an area where we know the community will do better. We've already gotten a number of community submissions. And I know in the styling for things like Symbian, the community is going to do better than we would. So let's go ahead and just do our build now. So we're in our My New App directory. And let's do a rake-t, and you can see all the cool tools that we have. And so we have the ability to build for BlackBerry, iPhone, Windows Mobile, and you can just build, or you can build and run for all of those. Now, notice any glaring omissions on that list? So there's no Android build right now. And in fact, that's sort of the missing piece we're not scheduled to release until March 10th anyway, but the team is furiously working on making sure that Android has to be, at a par with everything else. So it actually does run. It runs on devices pretty well. It runs really slow on emulators, which is why I'm not demoing it today. But we don't have the automated build. We have a step-by-step. If you go out to our wiki, we have a excruciating step-by-step guide for all of the environments, but most people just use the rake scripts now, and so we'll have the stuff for Android soon. So let's go ahead and do a build and run for iPhone. So you'll see it fires up my emulator, and I've got, and by the way, if I had my device connected, it would just launch that off as well on my device, which is a little bit harder to demo from. We ship with it. Obviously, you can put your own icons on it. This happens to be the icon that we ship with. The other thing I wanted to emphasize about this build process is it's just our framework around your app, right? Like nobody knows that it's Rhodes-based, right? So it's all just compiled together. Even though it's cooler now that I can do the rake scripts, the demo that you saw, I was doing my builds from Xcode. So it made it very obvious, right, that it's sort of just your app and we're effectively just some libraries. I think now with this black box, it may, with just a rake script, is not that easy necessarily to tell that this is just your running app. You can, it obviously won't have the Rhodes icon, but it's indistinguishable from any other app. So you see, this is the app that we created. It has a contacts list. And I can say create a new contact, give my name, because all the basic CRUD is built in. Obviously, you would want to go in and change the styling or just the layout of the fields, or add whatever you want. So now I've got Adam as a record, and I've got a link to new contact, and you'll party on these HTML files and edit it to your heart's content and create the user experience that you're looking for. Okay, so that's sort of writing the whole Rhodes app. There's this other thing of defining a RhoSync source, and as we mentioned, you're just really creating a handful of methods. You're creating a login method, so log into whatever your backend system is. You create a query method that retrieves and reads objects from the backend source. Our tutorial tells you what you have to do to write that query method. There is basically that query method brings it back into, typically you're getting it back as XML. Then we sort of separate the part from, you've done the query and now you want to like populate the cache on the server. The form that we cache it in is what we call object attribute value triples. The objects are called object values. And we have generic code in that sync operation that does it for the vast majority of your stuff. So you'll see it sort of takes apart what you've gotten back and it creates these object attribute value triples that can represent essentially arbitrary data. And one of the things that we do, and because this is a tech talk, I'll talk more about it than I generally, you haven't heard me talk about it before at other meetups. So one of the things that we do in RhoSync that's unusual is, so if you look at any of these other sync servers that have been out there, like IntelliSync and Motorola had this product called Starfish, and what they all do is they sort of have these databases here, and they figure out the data they needed to get, and they serialize it over the wire in some equivalent of object attribute values, right? Because it's a generic format that can handle sending anything, right? The object ID in question, an attribute like the user's address, and then the value. And then they get it on the other side and they sort of put it all back together in a database, right? And that's what they all do. And that's, in the end, it's a rather complex and expensive operation. So what RhoSync does that's a little bit unusual is takes it from the back end in a way that's usually a little bit closer to this object attribute value format because it's reading it from some kind of serialized XML anyway. This sync method that we provide, but you can sort of change if you need to, then creates these object values, right, on the server. When it goes, then it goes down to the device, we keep it in that object value format. So we basically create a copy of this sort of generic, you could call it a property bag schema, right? This generic property bag schema, this object value table, then exists on the device. So we don't have a whole bunch of relational tables, right? There's like the table. And the reason why we don't have to put it back together into relational tables is in 2009, people expect to use an ORM to program to, right? They're not expecting to write SQL statements. So when you write your Rhodes app, you're using ROM. I mean, you can write SQL statements against that object value table, right? The property bag schema if you want. But it's not going to seem like, your typical thing of like selecting from your users table and your locations table and your companies table. It's all in one table, and we get massive efficiencies by doing the sync to that one table, and yet it's still easy for the developer because they have an ORM that mediates it. So that's maybe more than you wanted to know about why we did things the way we did in RhoSync. Yes?
So even though you're using a SQLite, you're kind of, it's working more like a memcache, right?
Yeah.
And how is it different than the way you use a memcache?
It's not really different at all. I mean, it really does beg the question, is SQLite overkill? And it probably is, because it really is just a big table. So we've been talking about that. I believe SQLite is overkill for what we're doing there, and we'll probably do something more efficient there. It was like the fastest path to get it out there, right? But we absolutely do not need the power of SQLite, and on BlackBerry we don't. What we want to find is some real stripped down database that has far less, and then rely on the ROM, the ORM, to do most of the work for us. So on BlackBerry we don't actually use SQLite, we use Purstelite, which is simpler. And that's a whole other topic. It's like, what's the right back end given the simplicity of what we're really doing there? So it's a good question. So this is what you've seen. This is the process of generating a Rhodes app. So upcoming developments, we released O.3 in early February. The big changes were we had GPS across all the platforms, PIM access across the platforms. We added Symbian support. We actually added it for, there's a bunch of, I'm an adjunct at Carnegie Mellon. There's a bunch of PhD students doing Symbian projects, so they wanted us to do Symbian ahead of Android. That's my excuse for not doing Android before Symbian. I don't know if that washes, but our 1.0 release will be released in about a week, and that has full Android. The Android stuff is all checked in. You can actually build an app with it. It's just sort of a painful build process. So we have to add the rake scripts for Android, and then we can declare victory. It has device capabilities. It has camera support. It has SMS support. And the other thing that's coming up, and it'll probably be a couple weeks after that, is this product called RhoHub Hub. So you can think of RhoHub Hub as basic. How many people have seen what Heroku does? So what Heroku does, it's a hosted development site. Like you write your whole Rails app online. It's great stuff. I'm a big fan of Heroku. We had a number of people that said, I love Rhodes, but, I got to go set up a RhoSync server to do this. And, then I build the stuff, and I have all these versions that I need to make available to people. And we're going to make available a provisioning server, open source, to help people with that. But, okay, I've got to have a sync server, and then I have to have a provisioning server, and I have to set up these development environments, right, to do builds. Even if I use your rake scripts, I need to have something there that the rake scripts can call, right? The iPhone SDK has to be there. The Symbian SDK has to at least be installed. So what RhoHub does, it says you don't have to install anything. You don't have to install SDKs. You don't have to install a sync server. You don't have to install a provisioning server. You just get online. You generate your app. We generate both sides for you, right? The sync server stuff and the client-side stuff, and for each object, you only describe, the attributes for that object one time, right? That it does both client and server, and you edit it online, right? You generate the HTML, you edit the HTML online, and then you just say build. So that is actually, we're going to go to private beta very soon. So anybody that's interested, if you register on rhohub.com to get into private beta, we're going to let the first 100 people in. And as soon as our beta users tell us it's ready to go, then we'll go live. So I'm guessing that'll be something like the end of the month. I mean, it's primarily a service to just help accelerate people. So we're not really in a huge hurry to put it out there. It'll be when users say it's ready. So I guess my summary is why Rhodes and RhoMobile. We believe that the declarative tag-based approach to development has been shown sort of time and time again. That the whole web development paradigm of just writing HTML versus writing to the procedural code is more productive. We think that a rich client that takes advantage of the device and works against sync local data is a much better experience than a mobile remote web app. Luckily, that's not a hard sell much anymore. We allow you to write it once, and it works on all smartphones, and it's open source from the ground up. So with that, does it make sense to open the floor to questions?
Actually, I have a couple questions. So I'm curious if the framework itself can be treated as a shared library on some or all the platforms, or is it always bundled in, and what's the size of that? And I'm also curious if you, second question, for the rendering HTML and style sheets, are you taking a lot of the work that Apple did to sort of promote building apps that use a browser and sort of using all those same kind of style metaphors, or is that infringing and are you having to do something different that's the same design?
So what we've done is we actually have tried to do the latter, which is create a native-like experience like Apple was promoting for web apps that take advantage of iPhone-specific tags. And we started with the IUI to do that, and most of the stuff is IUI. But we've sort of gone further than that and tried to do that against all platforms. And there's varying degrees of ability to do that. I think if you see some of our more full-fledged apps, like if you you can download our Sugar CRM app or you can just build it locally. I think we've achieved that for iPhone. I think BlackBerry and Windows Mobile look pretty good We definitely have not gotten there for Symbian in terms of, I mean, the Symbian apps look like web apps. I mean, they're local data, right? And they have native device capability, but they're pretty plain. We just don't have all that knowledge. We're actually hoping our community is going to sort of contribute, styling as they do their projects, because we have developers that want to do Symbian support. And just because we're new to Android, it's probably fair to say that our Android apps are also pretty plain vanilla. So, I'm sorry, can you repeat your first question?
Is the framework a shared library, or can it be? It sounds like an iPhone, it can't be, but on Android, I expect it to be some component that you acquire.
Right now, I mean, it's a gem, right? So you do your gem install, and then that gem is available. Oh, you mean shared amongst all your apps, like DLL style or something?
Or if you install 5 apps, is anything shared?
No, nothing's shared. So this is actually a good question. We actually have the capability of doing this, and we've thought a lot about. Your point is well taken. We're between 2 and 3 megs. So you could say, geez, on some devices you install multiple apps, and they all take 2 and 3 megs. In other words, it's 2 and 3 megs after you've compiled anything. The good news is your app code's real small, right? So your app code on top of our stuff is almost imperceptible. But you're right, there's absolutely some duplication. We made a conscious decision to very much focus on the I just want to build my one app scenario. There's certainly some inefficiencies there, and to me, the idea that you want to make it more efficient by taking advantage of all these things that you have in all the apps, right? They all have a web server. They all have, they all have the RhoSync client. They all have the browser component. Isn't this duplication? You want to make it more efficient. We will do that eventually, sort of driven by user demand. I mean, it's the right question to ask, but it also sort of feels like the problem of success, right? People love it so much they want to release a bunch of apps. We also want to very much stay away from, we want Rhodes to be in the background, like it's your app, right? We don't want people to know that there's Rhodes, so we very much stay away from the idea that Rhodes is this runtime, right, that you get, and then you download apps for that runtime. That certainly would be a way around this efficiency problem, but I don't think it doesn't. We can do something more about shared libraries in the scenarios where people want to share things, but we would only go as far as you've described, with just the shared library. We would not go as far as, well, here's this Rhodes runtime and you can download apps. So full disclosure, we're only using 1.9 on everything but Java-based devices. So we're using 1.9 for Symbian, we're using 1.9 for iPhone, and we're using 1.9 for Windows Mobile. So Symbian, iPhone, Windows Mobile. We, on Android and BlackBerry, like JRuby did, JRuby's just too big. We always subset the Ruby anyway so that we fit, but JRuby was too big, so we started with XRuby, which is sort of a dead-ended project, but it was small enough to work with, and in the end, it's sort of our Ruby now. If maybe the second part of that question is, so are you guys like the mobile Ruby company? No, we're not the mobile Ruby company. We're the framework company. I'm a big fan of Ruby. I think there'll be native Rubies for all these devices, and I'm more than happy if it doesn't come from us. So today, to answer your question, we are 1.8 based, 1.86 based for Java-based platforms for both BlackBerry and Android, and then 1.9 for everything else. And we're sort of hoping that that either contributions come from the community to take everything up to 1.9, or that mobile Ruby implementations will emerge that we can just take advantage of. Yes? So one of the things, the question was, are there apps in the App Store that are built on this? So we have several developers that we're working with that we know are sort of about to release like imminently. When I say imminently, like in the next week or two. So all the people I mentioned are about to release. We don't know all the people that use our stuff. It's GitHub is even more sort of anonymous than SourceForge, right? SourceForge, they at least give you metrics, right? We know our like watchers on GitHub, and we know that we've gotten plenty of Git clones, but we don't have any real view into that. So there's so many apps in the App Store, people may well have used our stuff, and to do something simple and submit would be very easy. Would be easy to do, so there may be some. The developers that we've developed close relationships with, usually the reason why is they're doing fairly ambitious large projects, right? Like mobile Wikipedia. And so they're just in that whole testing cycle that you have with large projects, and we're a new framework. So the answer is none that we're aware of. There will be several, like if I come back and talk to you about RhoSync Hub in a month or something, there'll be several out there by then. No, so there's the Rule 332 that some of you are probably familiar with, and what that, because some people say, well, wait a minute, Ruby's an interpreter, and you can't have an interpreter. So turns out there's many apps that clearly have an interpreter embedded. So the like the iPhone Telnet client, there's a shell in, right? So there's clearly an interpreter there. So there's plenty of other interpreters in other apps. So having a Ruby interpreter per se is not violating. What you're not allowed to do per Rule 332 is download interpreted code, except with the exception of if you use the browser component, you're allowed to download JavaScript. But in any other context, like you can't download JavaScript as some like command line JavaScript or some kind of built-in JavaScript. You can't download any code which then gets interpreted, except with the exception of if JavaScript downloaded to your browser component. So what this means is there's nothing wrong with having the Ruby interpreter. If you want to sort of be violating, if you wrote code, it would be a little tricky to do this within our framework, but say you just said, I don't want to use your framework, I just want to use the Ruby. Somebody could deliberately try to write an infringing app by writing code that downloaded the Ruby and then executed it with our interpreter. And that is possible. In order to not give people some, that much rope to hang themselves, like we don't support eval. Like we took it out really to protect people from doing things that would allow them to be infringing unknowingly. But if somebody wants to be infringing, this is not going to stop them. There's ways to get at the whole dynamic nature of Ruby, beyond doing evals. There's other ways of doing it. And so they can be infringing if they want to. But if they really want to be infringing, there's a lot easier ways to do it than to use Rhodes or a Ruby interpreter for that matter. They could just get some shell interpreter, which is like 100th the size to do it. Yeah. It's about 3 megs now. I was sort of hoping it would be around 2. And we think there's some things that we can do to get back down to 2. It hasn't been our focus for 1.0, so we're right around 3 megs with your app. Your app plus it is about 3 megs. It's not actually a problem on any of the devices, like being that big. It just feels a little too big. It's a bit bigger than we wanted it to be for some of the reasons we talked about. Like, 3 megs is no big deal for one app, but you add enough 3 megs here and 3 megs there, and you're starting to talk, real overly large footprints. So there's some very specific things that we can do, like not having a full-on database to store the object values table. That would save us a lot of space. So there's a lot of room for optimization still, even though we're, if you look at sort of our footprint of our Ruby plus our framework versus like, Ruby plus Rails on a server, we're between 1 and 2 orders of magnitude smaller. But there's a fair amount of ways to go. So I would say that by, next several months we could get back down to 2 megs. But it's just hasn't sort of hit the top of the priority list. So I can tell you what we're all working on now is building a great Android implementation. Yeah.
So cross-platform is definitely very helpful. Are you planning any ability to escape into the native environment, though? So from the Java world, this would be like JNI, but
That's an interesting question. So, because it's all open source, you can absolutely feel free to mix in your own C libraries. One of the interesting specific scenarios is would you want the ability to get out from under your Ruby and call some Objective-C library, right? We're clearly doing it for specific device capabilities. So if it's just, I want to get to the GPS or accelerometer or all these things, but there may be some other contexts where you just say, I don't want to do this in Ruby, I want to do this in Objective-C, and I still want to use it from your app. So this is definitely possible to do, and we even have a Lighthouse ticket to have some documentation on the wiki on exactly how to do that, because I think that's a good thing to be able to do. The other thing is, and that's actually going to fall out of, we're going to have guides on the wiki for people that say, I love the approach that I get device capabilities with HTML tags, but I'm not willing to wait for you to provide that capability. So, for example, we had a developer that asked us about proximity detection, the whole controversial thing where Google used the proximity detection APIs and in your awesome search capability for Google for the iPhone. And so I've talked to developers that said, I would really like to have that proximity detection API in my Ruby code, right, as a Ruby call. And it's a very cool thing, and we'll eventually do it. It's probably not going to make the priority list for the next 3 releases, but we have developers that say, I want to do it today. So we'll have some documentation on the wiki that says, okay, you want to create your own tag for something device specific. Here's how you go do it.
Actually, what native libraries can you access Accelerometer?
Well, Accelerometer is very high on the list. Actually, Accelerometer will be 1.1. So we're doing our 1.0, which we're in the finishing strokes of, and then Accelerometer is just very high on the list. And it's on enough different devices that it makes sense to do. Proximity detection, because it's not really on a lot of devices, will be somewhat lower on the list.
So, what would the time frame be to build an Android app that uses the barcode scanner?
We're very much driven by customer requests. So if we had somebody who's actively developing an app and they say, I want barcode scanning, we'll just do it. So if you look at sort of our roadmap, it really isn't. One of the reasons people say, well, why is it 1.0? 1.0 is essentially everything we sort of talked about doing, a reasonably robust set of device capabilities. The basic, write your app as HTML, and it runs across all the major platforms. So 1.0, we're sort of done what the core of what our ideas are. So now we are like a customer feature request machine. So file a Lighthouse issue and we'll do it.
And your customers could build those in open source.
Absolutely, yes. And that's what I was saying is we're going to put documentation on the wiki. We have all of our documentations up on the wiki now. We've even had customers edit it, for us on the wiki, say, well, I think we need to add this step. And we'll have documentation on the wiki that says, here's how you go and add your own capability to our set. Yeah.
So this is going to be another very specific question for Android, but so Android is meant to be extensible for the use of intents. So are there any specific plans for an intent, gateway? Because that would at least partially solve the question of barcode scanner.
So if this is like a better way to access device capabilities, then probably yes. We don't have any specific plans around that now, and we probably just need to get. Yeah, there's no question we're still learning about Android, so we should probably have a direct discussion about it afterwards, and we'd love to be educated by you guys on that. Yeah. Aha, that's an excellent question. So it really was always about, the question was, can RhoSync run in online mode rather than just offline mode? And I think, tell me if this is answering your question. So RhoSync sort of makes the assumption that the server, the RhoSync server, connects to your backend, grabs all the data it needs to, has it available for whenever that mobile client chooses to connect, and then gets that data to the client. So there's a scenario where a client just wants to immediately get data from the back end, and for which it really doesn't make sense to be storing these object value triples on the server. It really just wants data from the back end. And in fact, the specific requester of this was Wikipedia. They said, we don't need to store this stuff in the mediating server. We like the mediating server sort of doing the work to connect. So we call this the ask, or it's the synchronous. It's basically a synchronous query capability. And so there's another method that you can add. Remember, we talked about the 6 methods. Logon query. That's a query sync. There's an ask method. So you can implement an ask method, and then what happens is, if the controller gets this ask request, right? You write it in your app, that it calls out to the controller's ask request on the device. So then the controller does the ask request out to the RhoSync server, and then calls the source adapter's ask method, which then synchronously queries the backend and then brings the data right back. And that's actually how Wikipedia is implemented now. And you can actually, not only can you go look at the Wikipedia app, it's up on GitHub, but we actually take that source adapter and we ship it with RhoSync, just because I like that example of the synchronous method. So this is actually a good question. So what you're sort of saying is there a Rhodes that basically runs on a desktop or a server? You could think of it as like a lightweight Rails, right? Is there a Rhodes framework? No, there isn't today. It's definitely been requested. We'll probably do it soon, and it's not so much because you really want to use Rhodes as your website building thing. I'm a big fan of Rails. RhoSync itself is a Rails app. It almost doesn't matter what it's written in, but it happens to be a Rails app. So if you're building a server app, theoretically you could use Rhodes, but I would say use Rails. It's a better framework for that kind of thing. But you do want the ability, it would be nice to be able to just sit on your device, on your laptop, and run Rhodes on your laptop without necessarily running emulators to test. And so we will do that. What you're getting at is, I think what you're getting at is okay, I'm writing all this Ruby code to write my mobile device local thing. I want to be able to share code with the mobile web version. And I think that's an interesting goal. The question would be, and we're not focused on this now, but it's an intriguing thing. Could you say, okay, I get the fact that Rhodes is not what Rails is, right? Like a full thing to be like a web server environment, but maybe it could be just something for sort of serving mobile web clients. It's an intriguing idea. I think it's an open question whether we'd be really better than Rails at that. My gut is we probably wouldn't be, but I think it's worth, if somebody's really going to try to do that, if you were really going to try to do that, we would probably look at what could we do with sort of shared Ruby libraries to make that easier.
So I think that the real question though was I have this view of my app on mobile,
Yeah, no, I get that. So, and I think that because models are just Ruby classes, like if you're using Rails, I think you could probably do that sort of ad hoc, right? Just have the same model. But there may be things that we can do to make that even easier, right? Like maybe have like, you start your app in Rhodes and you want to have like your Rails export, or maybe it's the reverse. I've already written my Rails app. I want sort of a Rails sort of model import thing. So we don't have that today, but I think it's a good suggestion. It's just a sample, yeah. It's all of the objects. It's quite robust. It's actually probably a little bit more extensive than some of the apps that are out on the iPhone. So yeah, it's there and it's free for anybody to use. Yeah.
So is RhoHub code open sourced to the point where you could create your own implementation on App Engine, for example, and use all the methods and everything that you have, or would you sort of re-implement it kind of from scratch if you were going to build the equivalent on App Engine?
So RhoHub today, we didn't, it's actually up on GitHub, but it's private because we sort of didn't want to confuse users. Almost all the key pieces like the provisioning server and the build scripts sort of have their own check-ins, like the build scripts are in the Rhodes check-in. The RhoSync server, which is a big piece of it, is in RhoSync. There is this sort of web glue in between where we sort of, I think, tied the Rhodes client and the RhoSync server and the provisioning. We sort of made that workflow a little easier to do. And the question would be, do we take that sort of thin web wrapper and open source that itself? I think we're open to doing that if somebody really wants to build their own RhoHub. But I think I'd want to sort of just hear from somebody because I almost worry about just confusing developers. Like today, our message is, if you want us to sort of host everything for you, just use RhoHub. If you want to do it yourself, just get Rhodes and get RhoSync. If there was demand and people wanted to build their own, we're really only doing the hosted thing, not to try to make money with it like Heroku or whatever. We're really just doing it as a way to accelerate people's success. So if somebody else like App Engine wanted to do a RhoHub, we would be very encouraging of that scenario. Okay.
Any more questions? All right.
Great.
Well,
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Adam for coming today, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks.